Hi there, welcome back to my channel, Ben's Autism, ADHD and the Joy of Tangents channel. The book, The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Differently Wired Brain, has many important themes, but perhaps the most important of them all is the, in some senses, spiritually incendiary idea that if you are neurodiverse, then a good general approach to navigating the often brutal and inhospitable neurodiverse world is to create a niche for one's neurodiverse self in that world. For, as I'll elaborate further on in this video, if you succeed in creating a niche in the world, then it follows that your intellectual deficits are likely to be minimalized and your intellectual aptitudes are likely to be magnified. Or, as the pop star Rihanna once entitled a song, it is thereafter generally a case of we found love in a hopeless place. At any rate, on the dust jacket of this brilliant book, The Power of Neurodiversity, unleashing the advantages of your differently wired brain, it is promised that the book will coherently demonstrate how to take advantage of assistive technologies and what's to come in the future. This was written in 2010. There is an online article called The Downsides of the Outboard Brain, The Fate of Human Memory by Merlin Mann. Even that was published in 2007. And thus, although 20th century philosopher and social scientist Karl Popper once rather devastatingly said of that much maligned pseudoscience futurology, if we knew what the future was, it wouldn't be the future. Nevertheless, many journalists and commentators are, in late October 2025, predicting that the AI bubble, which has been inflating exponentially for dozens of consecutive months now, will at some point soon fairly seismically burst. I've talked previously on this YouTube channel about Leon Trotsky's versatile applicable formula, the transformation of quantity into quality, the most important law of dialectical logic. So then, the AI bubble will soon burst. But I was at my piano lesson on Thursday morning in Sheffield, and my stern but tender teacher, Anne Norgate, I've referred previously on this channel to Muriel Sparks' devastatingly honest linguistic formulation to describe what social workers often crudely call no-hopers, namely duffers. Well, she probably thinks I'm that kind of all things success-wise doomed student. At any rate, we were talking in between spurts of piano playing and piano commentary on Thursday morning, and she suddenly said, "Oh, I hear that students now at university are complaining that AI isn't delivering them essays to their precise high expectations and standards." Which rather got me thinking. If then the AI bubble soon bursts, then will students attempt to shock, horror, think for themselves, and attempt to gasp, actually write essays themselves? Well, as Antonio Gramsci once said, the pessimism of the intellect, the optimism of the will. And yet, as I've said before, I am no celestial figure. Thus, I'll categorically, predictably never achieve something similar to that key moment from Thomas Kuhn's 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, namely, become a bona fide anomaly who changed the entire course of scientific history. However, as Chris Packham says during the end of the introduction to his 2023 TV series, Inside Our Autistic Minds, if I can change the mind of just one autistic person watching, then all this will have been worth it. Indeed, during his celebrated 1905 biography of Charles Dickens, G.K. Chesterton rather memorably says of the young Dickens's attempts to master the notoriously esoterically elusive arts of successful journalism, it was an art that can only be affected with time, and he had to affect it with overtime. Indeed, in 1999, the late sociologist Ulrich Beck wrote a book called The Brave New World of Work. Well, during my sociology course between 2021 and 2022 at Sheffield Hallam University, one of my teachers described how, although in post-structuralist sociologist Michael Foucault's work there is, in the form of the panopticon, the strange social phenomena of the few watching the many, i.e., usually prison guards vis-a-vis prison inmates. Nevertheless, sometimes, he said, with contemporary society's obsession with celebrity culture, it is a case of pace Foucault's formulation, the many watching the few. Well, the discourse has over the years also thrown up various variations of the formulation, the violent intimacy between writer and reader. And autistic pioneer psychologist Hans Asperger once optimistically said, if the autistic child can find a comrade like himself. And in our own day, autism studies pioneer naturalist Chris Packham, to reiterate, obviously but importantly, said, if I can change the mind of just one autistic person watching, then all this will have been worth it. But at any rate, further into the dust jacket of the power of neurodiversity, unleashing the advantages of your differently wired brain, it is said, a passionate, compassionate, practical look at the myriad strengths of anyone who is differently abled. The Power of Neurodiversity is essential reading for parents, educators, mental health professionals, and anyone intrigued by how our brains work and what secrets they hold. Call me pedantic, however, upon reading this recently, I suddenly thought, why does Mr. Armstrong deploy these three words? And even more importantly, why in this particular order? Well, vis-a-vis my old occupational therapist, Lisa Schutt, who worked with me in a rehab house in Leeds between 2016 and 2017, after I had been sectioned in the same city. But I once said to her, with attempted raffish laconicness, the mathematical concept of sequence, Lisa. Additionally, however, this whole notion of secrets our brains hold, which Armstrong also alludes to here, well, when teenagers are starting out on their intellectual journeys, they often come across perhaps initially always somewhat bemusing formulations such as free intellectual inquiry. Well, when I was 16, in 2003, having only just then become radicalized, I was obsessed with defending Marxism from the rival theoretical standpoints imaginable, from postmodernism to classical liberalism, you name it. Or, from today's perspective, looking backwards and forwards at the same time, as Bob Dylan once said, but I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. So, if free intellectual inquiry is the privileged position I occupy now in late 2025, how does one classify the general approach to intellectual matters that I possessed back in 2003 when I was 16? Well, one eccentric example, especially seeing as how I am these days ultra radical centre left on the political spectrum rather than centre right, is the damning psychological diagnosis that's at the heart of centre right political figure Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. Yes, I had a closed mind back then, and yet Alan Bloom also wrote a famous introduction to one recent edition of John Dewey Rousseau's classical 1762 educational textbook, Emile or On Education. And 2003 was an incredible year for my effectively embryological intellectual development. For Anthony Giddens still had hegemony in the sociological sphere, just as Tony Blair still had hegemony in the political sphere. And yet, Seamus Milne wrote the perfect rejoinder to Francis Fukuyama's notoriously presumptuously pro-bourgeois 1992 utterance, The End of History, with his 2012 book, The Revenge of History, insofar as, although Anthony Giddens wrote about the still indispensable sociological and political thinker Karl Marx during his 1971 sociology textbook, Capitalism and Modern Social Theory, namely about Marx's enthusiastic grandiosity that, after initially surfacing in Marx's youth, over the years never quite left him. Well, let's just say that Giddens was shamelessly, insufficiently critical regarding that most undeniable enthusiastic grandiosity type of political actions, namely Tony Blair's Labour government's ardent collusion with the notorious book avoider George W. Bush's shock and awe policy of carpet bombing Iraq back in 2003. But seeing as how Giddens, in another book of his, 1982's Profiles and Critiques in Social Theory, again says 10 years is a long time in sociology. Therefore, 22 years since the shock and awe monstrous moments in Iraq, the radical left imprint Verso have recently brought out a book about the excitingly still fledgling Your Party of Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn called The Return of the Left. Indeed, during the introduction to the book, The Power of Neurodiversity, there is a glowing recommendation of the book by the Times Higher Education Supplement, which includes the lines, "It is sensible in examining how other cultures, past and present, have accepted forms of neurodiversity and it is wise in its critique of the use of normative standardizations to identify objectives in education and society in general. There are several things to say about this analytical statement. Firstly, Honoré de Balzac once, in the 19th century, said during his novel Old Man Goriot, "However gross a man may be, the minute he expresses a strong and genuine affection, some inner secretion alters his features, animates his gestures, and colours his voice. The stupidest of man will often, under the stress of passion, achieve heights of eloquence, in thought, if not in language, and seem to move in some luminous sphere." Secondly, Albert Einstein once, in the 20th century, said, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." Thirdly, I note how in our century, and in that is the Times from Friday 17th of October 2025, Danny Finkelstein has an article preoccupied with the theme "Letters to My Sons," next to which the generally shrewd Scouse actor Stephen Graham is photographed with his hand over his heart, seemingly in mid-swoon, Balzac style. At any rate, during the same introduction to the book The Power of Neurodiversity, it is said by Publishers Weekly, Armstrong argues that there is no normal brain or normal mental capability, and that we are making a serious mistake in assuming that the kinds of differences we see in people with conditions like autism and dyslexia involve only deficits. People with these conditions also have strengths, he emphasizes, and by focusing on these, rather than on the labels, we can find modes of learning and living that can help them thrive. Karl Marx famously devoted much social scientific attention to the theory of modes of production. Well, we are still, of course, living in the capitalist mode of production. However, it's refreshing that even such a sometimes inhospitable economic cum superstructural place, so to speak, that analytically alluring word mode can be powerfully applied to other things than society-wide, generally applying production arrangements, so to speak. And vis-a-vis a longer phrase from the passage just quoted, namely modes of learning and living, well, when I studied history and philosophy at Leeds University between 2005 and 2007, I was, I recall, once talking to a student who was studying the popular music course that was on offer at that institution. He once exclaimed to me in an almost offended manner after I had expressed enthusiasm for the music of Claude Debussy. In the London Review of Books archives from 1980, tantalising references made to the fastidious impressionism of Debussy and Mallarmé. And indeed, during the 1986 documentary What Happened to Kerouac, left-leaning Beat Generation fellow traveller Michael McClure says, "Mallarmé says that poetry is the language of crisis. Each novel of Jack's is a response to a crisis." At any rate, so I had expressed to Mike my enthusiasm for the music of Claude Debussy, and yet he at once extraordinarily exclaimed to me that, "But Ben, Debussy didn't live life. What the fuck?" So the great Claude Debussy, so great that he rather debatably achieved in the creative sphere of music what Stéphane Mallarmé achieved in the sphere of poetry, did not live life. Ha ha ha. I think my fellow Leeds University attendee Mike was somewhat misguided in opining away like that in such a cynical and ultimately philistine manner. For, far from not living life, the aesthetic achievements and aesthetic states of heightened consciousness that Debussy achieved in his life surely puts him in the same league as the walking reference of Oscar Wilde's secretly socialistic statement, "To live is the rarest thing in the world. Most people exist. That is all." However, that great writer who could also turn crisis-strewn flurry of letter composition activity into novels, in his case into novels like 1964's Herzog, Saul Bellow, once had the perfect antidote to the potential chilling Nietzschean elitism of Wilde's formulation when he observed reassuringly the universal eligibility to be noble, or, as they have for many years said in Sheffield, to phrase it in what might perhaps be termed the aspirational vernacular, everyone's a winner. Indeed, during an introductory page of the book The Power of Neurodiversity, Kathleen Seidel, creator of Neurodiversity.com, says, "In this engaging, accessible book, Armstrong offers a thoughtful consideration of cognitive diversity and many practical suggestions for maximizing the potential of and increasing respect for those who are differently brained. In previous YouTube videos on this channel, I've alluded to punk poet par excellence, John Cooper Clarke's succinctly sublime phrase, top of the range, popular. He said this on BBC Six Music back in 2016. However, obviously but importantly, John Cooper Clarke is one of those writers who is active across many media outlets. During his also aforesaid BBC TV programme, The Secret Life of Books, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, he alludes to Thomas de Quincey's great performance-enhancing drugs literary hero, namely the dyspraxic Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Again, to reiterate, Samuel Taylor Coleridge once conceived, crafted, and completed a work called Dejection, an Ode. Well, in relation to the aforesaid quote from Thomas Armstrong's book, The Power of Neurodiversity, well, somehow Coleridge was able in his professional life to move from dejection and ode type spiritual terrain to what, in his widely praised 1988 biography, Coleridge Early Visions, Richard Holmes, with ephemeral tantalizingness, calls literary glory. And however much the second half of Holmes' two-part biography, namely Coleridge Darker Visions, suggests the conceptual extension of what F. Scott Fitzgerald once suggested, uncannily similarly moving from his youthful, more positive vibes work, Early Success, to his maturer, more negative vibes work, The Crack Up, a two-part psychological cum social process, which he summed up in the phrase, that goddamn bitch success. Our apologies to feminists of all counties and countries for that one, by the way. Nevertheless, in many senses, the dyspraxic and thus autistic spectrum-dwelling figure, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, was often in his life able to put into practice that old, almost ancient neurodiverse dream, namely to move from dejection and ode territory to literary glory territory. Or, as the also dyspraxic Jack Kerouac, whose On the Road was once described as stylistically owing more to Walt Whitman than to F. Scott Fitzgerald, and his Beat Generation fellow travellers often expressed it, from beat down to beatific. From beat down to beatific. I suppose it's a bit like that moment in impish, profound Irish writer Roddy Doyle's novel, Oh Play That Thing, where his chief protagonist, Henry Smart, actually meets another Armstrong, Louis Armstrong, and whilst performing his New York sidewalk strolling sandwich board man's daily rituals, often sloganistically pep talks himself with the phrase, every day in every way. Again, as W.H. Auden once said, routine in a man is a sign of ambition. Or to quote from elsewhere from the same poet's archive, a poet who was a great friend of Benjamin Britten, who, for the record, I was named after by my biological mum, Sarah Ward, before she died tragically of cancer in 1988 when I was still a 1-year-old. The tune is catching, and it will not stop. Again, Melvin Bragg has a protagonist say of On the Road during his novel Crossing the Lines. But what a sound! Hanif Qureshi, also influenced by the dyspraxic Jack Kerouac, wrote the coquettishly conceptually titled book Midnight All Day. Therefore, the universally alluring poetic concept, the tune is catching and it will not stop, can quickly become a benign form of the also dyspraxic Samuel Johnson's formulation. Habits are easy to form and hard to break. And yet there are debatably good habits and debatably bad habits. The Guardian on Saturday, 18th October 2025, had an article entitled, Doe, Welcome to the Golden Ages of Stupidity by Sophie McBain. In it, it's said of the American technology researcher, around 2 years ago, she began receiving out the blue emails from strangers who reported they had started using large language models such as ChatGPT and felt their brain had changed as a result. Their memories didn't seem as good. Was that even possible, they asked her? Well, vis-a-vis Marcel Proust, very much a the tune is catching and it will not stop kind of guy. Well, his creative work has often been ascribed as being layered, proving that human brains will always, I think, be more intensely subtle than AI brains. And when they are, this always leads to a higher quality of life. When they are not, quality of life declines. AI in its capitalist guise is obsessed with quantitative expansion rather than sustaining high qualitative levels of activity and experience. So what should be numerous dreamlike Madeline moments every day become for millions numerous AI capitalist nightmare treadmill moments. And critical thinking is also a casualty. So therefore, AI machines tell us not to think too critically about millions of things, but including the lack of critical thinking of AI machines. Franz Kafka, obviously but importantly, did aesthetically pioneering work vis-a-vis the universal themes of both bureaucracy and the universal theme of writing machines. However, perhaps even Kafka, with his well-known pessimistic formulation, "In the battle between you and the world, back the world," could not have predicted the full scope of the general malaise we are now in. However, in my opinion, neurodiverse people are often intensely independent thinkers, so perhaps Asperger's lost tribe, as we've occasionally been referred to as, can somehow, during the second quarter of the 21st century, help humanity to fight back against stupidity, malign forms of AI, and creeping fascism. It's certainly worth the daily fight, I think. Indeed, the book The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Differently Wired Brain, still during the introduction, is described by Ari Neerman, president of the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, as being an engaging and provocative look into the emerging societal conversation about neurological diversity. Our country has adapted to many new ideas over the last century. Acceptance of the broad scope of neurodiversity represents the next step forward. Engaging and provocative. Again, two very specific words in a very specific order. Thus proving then that neurodiverse minds like crude as well as subtle things. And yet Donald Trump's administration has drastically cut funding for neurodiverse/disability education, which Mr. Neerman's organisation has admirably and valiantly already launched a robust campaign against, according to their website. In the debatably underrated book, The Oxford Dictionary of Sociology, Theodore Adorno's concept of the authoritarian personality is said to be possessed by individuals who are, amongst many other authoritarian characteristics, simply intolerant of human individuals who are imaginative and tender-minded. Again, neurodiverse minds often like crude as well as subtle things. Thus, while sympathizing deeply with all imaginative and tender-minded people under attack from the Trump administration, we should also go on to the offensive, seeing as how Karl Marx once, with militant impishness, said, "Replace the weapon of criticism with the criticism of the weapon." After all, on the one hand, Virginia Woolf, decades before Judith Butler wrote Gender Trouble, attempted to popularize the from normative standpoints, cognitive dissonance generating idea of the androgynous mind. And on the other hand, elsewhere during his book of literary criticism, The Violent Effigy, a study of Dickens's imagination, John Carey tantalizingly alludes to Henry James's observation upon meeting Charles Dickens, namely, the extraordinary impression caused by his military eye. Hopefully, this latest paragraph of script of mine has also been engaging and provocative, just as Thomas Armstrong's book has persuasively, I think, been described by another neurodiverse person. Indeed, if it has been so, then I've only been acting naturally, as the Beatles once urged, albeit attempting to act naturally in a world where, as Gang of Four once observed, whilst about gaining reputations for spoiling parties with punky sneers, nature's not in it. Indeed, in his neurodiverse classic book, Pretending to be Normal, Tony Attwood, with subtle impish scientificness, implies that being some kind of deviant is every neurodiverse person's birthright, especially at parties, latter which the aforesaid Virginia Woolf often wrote so epicenely and enchantingly about. And indeed, as Yosemite Sam, also on YouTube, has inspirationally and accurately said on her YouTube channel, if you are ADHD, then the classic binary distinction between introvert and extrovert is simply a redundant classificatory term. Or, as Walt Whitman, himself partial to the odd shindig show-up, 19th century style, once said, both in and out of the game and watching and wondering at it. Now that's the sort of thing that will raise an eyebrow during CV-related communications over at thinly veiled capitalist creative institutions such as LinkedIn.com. Christina Patterson, after all, in her 2016 article, Memorizing poetry is an art of the heart, describes people who are almost unseemingly obsessively fascinated by poetry as being among the most unemployable people she has ever met. And yet, great men like Karl Marx could never quite secure official employment either. His appalling handwriting scuppered his chances of becoming a professional railway worker, for example. And yet, it was the same Marx who wrote debatably one of the greatest works of science of all time, 1867's Capital. And yet, again, we can see a clear salvational pathway from what Samuel Taylor Coleridge once went to entire poem-length proportions to elucidate dejection, an ode to what Jack Kerouac and the Beat Generation perpetually pursued in exaltation-saturated positive metamorphoses from beat down to beatific. Indeed, in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile or On Education, he at one point alludes to the general educational experience of the ceaseless movement from the lower to the higher. Life is an inherently bittersweet enterprise, aye, and yet, as that most unlikely of sometimes aspirationally highbrow subjects touching figure, Ronan Keating, asked Lisa Shutt, once sang, life is a roller coaster, just gotta ride it. Revolutionary times are particularly emotionally turbulent ones. I wish anyone still watching the best of luck in navigating such psychologically demanding days as these. However, often, despite all the negative psychological mood swings, I think there is still the possibility for our class, the working class, the only truly revolutionary class, to win, truly win, the coming battles that lie ahead. See you next time.